Welcome everyone. Welcome to this session of forced migration in the arts. The idea behind forced migration in the arts is that we bring together people with lived experience of forced migration, academics and art spaces for conversation looking at what is happening at the intersection where forced migration and the arts meet. For this session, which is going to be the third and final session for this month or for today, we've got Camilla Reeve, who is an editor and a publisher. And we've also got Jennifer Langer, who is also an editor and runs Exiled Writers Ink. With this is as far as my introduction will go. Jennifer and Camilla will introduce themselves and talk about the work that they are doing. On this note, I hand over to you, Jennifer and Camilla.
Okay, Jennifer, do you want to kick off?
Yes, sure. I'm sure you will. Hello, everyone, and hello to Barbara. I'm sure you've all seen the bios that appeared on Ambrose's publicity, but if not, I'll bore you a little by telling you about myself. So I have a background in education. I worked in further education colleges, running refugee education projects. I am editor of 4 anthologies of exiled literature. The Bend in the Road, which was published with a teaching pack and was very, very popular because it was an innovative anthology featuring the new refugees who were arriving in the UK at the time. Prior to that, the focus had been on Afro-Caribbean and South Asian writers in terms of anthologies. This was published in about 1998-9. Then Crossing the Border, that had a focus on refugee and exiled women whose voices weren't really heard in the first anthology. And I kind of wasn't as aware then about gender politics and polarization between the genders and so on. And so this book focuses solely on women's voices, refugee women's voices. Then If Thought Has Memory was an anthology of Jewish exiled writing. However, those writers define themselves, whether practicing Jews or Jews in name only, whatever. And the focus was not on the Holocaust, but on Jews from Africa. On the cover, there's an image of some needlework by an Ethiopian Jew from Latin America and the Middle East, as well as from a few countries in Europe whose citizens were forced to leave because of communism. Then there was a sort of update of The Bend in the Road, The Silver Throat of the Moon, Writing in Exile, which not only contains short stories and poems, but also essays by refugee and exiles. And all those were published by Five Leaves, based in Nottingham. We celebrated our 20th anniversary with this lovely anthology called Resistance, published by Palewell Press. So that's Resistance, Voices of Exiled Writers. If you would like to know, I can explain. each chapter focuses on an aspect of our literary activism. So it starts in 2000, I believe. It focuses on Kosovo and ends with Black Lives Matter 2020. Of course, some of these conflicts are continuing, unfortunately, but that's what this book is about. Then there's my own poetry book, which was published by Reeve Press, called The Search, and it explored my background in tandem with the current refugees' experiences. So I'm the founding director of Exiled Writers Ink. And I hold a doctorate from SOAS in cultural memory and literature, focusing on exiled Iranian Jewish women. That's about it, really. That's all about exile.
You make it
I'm sure we'll be exploring
you make it sound a lot less amazing than it truly is.
We'll be exploring, no doubt, how it began, how and why it began, and what it does. But I think I've spoken long enough for now. So now I'll ask Camilla about, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah. Well, I come from a family which is partly Jewish and was caught up in the Holocaust, and the other half is Irish and had experience of the potato famine in Ireland when a lot of people died. And my parents were very strongly socialist, and they felt it was their job to help people. And even though I had a career in computers for about 30 years, I went on writing. And when I retired from the computer side, I decided to set up a company publishing books with refugees and other books. And that was about 7 years ago, quite recent compared to Jennifer, who has been busy doing all these wonderful things for about 20 years. But it was interesting. I wanted to write and publish books which were looking at human rights and the environment, because it seemed to me that one of the biggest drivers of refugee problems was climate change, and that we couldn't solve one problem without solving the other. So that was the reason why those two themes are very much at the heart of what Palewell Press does. And I think I've published about 80 books so far over the 7 years. Far too many. I'm trying to cut down and do a better job. It's very easy to get swept away, wanting to be helpful, wanting to help people share their story. And suddenly you wake up 7 or 8 years later and think, are you doing exactly what you need to do for people? And so this is the year when Palewell Press will re-emphasize its interest in human rights, and a much greater proportion of our work next year will be about human rights and less of it about nature, though we'll still be interested in that. And it will also be a year when, hopefully, we become seen as a London, Southwest London publisher on human rights rather than an international one. Because London is one of the world's cities that has an enormous variety of people who have been displaced. They come from everywhere. a few years ago, it was more than 40% of Londoners came from somewhere else. And I feel with them that sense that they're not being heard, they're not being recognized, they don't have a platform. It's difficult enough to put food on the table and find somewhere for the children to sleep. But all of these people have stories. And some of them in particular are writing those stories, and I feel involved in trying to help them share those. So as well as more human rights books, hopefully, compared to nature books, there'll also be more of an emphasis on London and the populations of London and the people coming through it. So that's kind of my current aim. It seems to me that it's inescapable for me that we need to build a more fair and equitable world. And one of the key tools for doing that is publishing. It's sharing narratives, sharing aims, collaborating with people, and getting words out there that will, each of them, change somebody's way of looking at things, deepen it or broaden it, make it more close to lived experience. And it was a great thrill for me to work with Jennifer on that book, which has an entry for every single year that Exiled Writers have been functioning. The book focuses on key projects in each of those years from 2000. And I really liked it because it was a mixture of poetry and prose. And that's very much a part of what Palewell Press does. This book, which we published with the Nottingham Refugee Forum and Nottingham Trent University's Post-Colonial Studies Centre, that is all about a group of women who are, if you like, irregularly migrated, trafficked, economic migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and they all were living in Nottingham, having been placed there by our heroes at the Home Office. And the book has not just creative writing, but their photographs. They wanted to be photographed. I was astonished. I didn't really expect women to want their photographs when they were having such a stressful time, but they definitely did, and their recipes from where they used to live. So it's an interesting mixture, this book. Like a number of Palewell Press books, it tries to shape itself around the story that somebody wants to tell rather than forcing them into a mold they have to follow. But I've got a few questions for Jennifer. Is that okay, Jennifer? I'm just fascinated by what Exiled Writers. I mean, when you founded Exiled Writers 20 years ago, more than 20 years, in 2000, I'm sure you saw a need for it then, but do you think things have changed? Is the environment that you're working in?
Explain a little bit about how it started?
Yes.
So really, it was never planned at all. I was, as I mentioned, working with refugees from a range of backgrounds, medicine, literature, journalism, and I became fascinated by their stories and their background because interviewing them was key to placing them in the correct provision at the college. And at the time, nothing much had changed in relation to your question. There was a great deal of demonization of refugees. They were scapegoated, considered bogus, illiterate, a burden. And so there was a lot of stereotyping, and I felt that this needed to be contested, that the mainstream community needed to hear their stories, needed to gain an insight not only into the pain of the refugee experience, but also the complexity of the backgrounds and experiences of writers from different regions, their languages, literary histories. And so, yes, I felt it was imperative that the refugees' voices and narratives were heard. And at the time, while government and voluntary organisations kind of tried to meet the practical needs of the refugees, there wasn't really any outlet for their creativity or sharing their stories. And sharing is very important because they come together in creative writing sessions at our monthly Exiled Lit Cafe, even in terms of our editorial committee that produces our magazine. And also at this time, I researched and edited The Bend in the Road, the first anthology I produced, and that received sort of interest by the media, especially, and the education media, especially given that there was an education pact with it. And in no time at all, I was being contacted by organisations, schools and so on, asking for workshops, etc., with refugees. And then Exiled Writers, I think it was at the first meeting at the Poetry Cafe, they were clamouring for an organisation for themselves. And really that's how it started. It was never sort of planned in the way you suggest. So
do you think things have changed, or are they still as challenging as they used to be?
I think there are always challenges, new challenges, practical challenges, the cost of renting homes, council waiting lists, problem of, benefits. The Rwanda situation has reared its ugly head. One of our key sort of aims is to, or activities, is to engage in literary activism. So we advocate human rights and social justice through literature and literary activism. And was it last year or the year before, a small group of us went to the Royal Courts of Justice and stood outside and read a statement against, the government's proposals, and read poetry to the crowds, which was sort of quite amazing. And then we also wrote a letter containing that statement to the Guardian, which was published and signed by lots of Exiled Writers Ink people, including Nazrin. Yes, so there are always new challenges, aren't there? It's never ending. I remember, to begin with, most refugees came to London. It was inconceivable that they could live anywhere else at the time. London had resources and refugee groups, refugee community organisations, and it was quite an upheaval for refugees, for asylum seekers to be relocated, dispersed, it was called, to these places like, Leeds and Nottingham, where there was no provision for them. That sort of changed because refugees are everywhere now, which is a good thing. And hopefully, communities are welcoming them. debatable. Would you like to know a little bit more about what we do?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm intrigued.
So
The
we develop and promote the creative literary expression of both developing and established refugee and migrant writers. We aim to increase their representation in the mainstream literary world. We aim to develop cross-cultural dialogue. And finally, as I mentioned, we engage in literary activism to advocate for human rights and social justice, which includes the situation here in the UK. And we do this by delivering creative writing workshops, live literature performance events, monthly Exiled Lit cafes. We used to engage in theatre. We produced different productions. One was called Breaking the Silence, Somali Women Speak Out, and that was a tour funded by the Arts Council. And then we had a fantastic project in Europe and London called And the City Spoke, which explored with refugee writers in Belgium, Italy, and Poland their new spaces. So the languages were layered. So the audience heard the original language of the refugee and the new language of the refugee, perhaps living in Warsaw or Brussels. And we ran workshops around schools in Warsaw. We staged the production for students in Gdynia. It was amazing. And then we also, have run mentoring and translation projects, which culminated in the production of chapbooks, pamphlets. And a couple of years ago, our pamphlets were shortlisted for the Michael Marks Awards, Poetry Pamphlets Awards. We produce Exiled Ink magazine. It used to be in hard copy, like this, but now it's online.
So do you find, is the work shared out? Is the work shared across the whole organisation? Who sort of does all the different things?
I would say it is, but you asked me about change, and I suppose one more recent change prior to October the 7th and Gaza was the racism against Black people, the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So we've been organising kind of workshops and readings at different venues in London, and the aim is to form a sort of permanent anti-racist exiled writers collective. So in a small way, we're trying to provide insight into the complexity of identities, to contest people's sort of notions of what a Jew is, what a Muslim is, what a Black person is.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting when a writer and I, one of the exiled writers and I, went to Harrow and ran a workshop for Afghan women, and we took along sort of objects related to our identity. So they could be religious objects or just meaningful objects. But I did take in a plaited loaf, which is traditional for the sort of Friday night meal that a family has. It's called challah in England. And the women started talking about, and they tasted, they all tasted the bread, and then they all started talking about the Jewish community that used to live in Herat in Afghanistan, and it was amazing to form those connections, really. So that's, I think the racism, it seems to be more accentuated now than when we started. There was hostility to refugees, but now it's more in terms of, religious identities, especially now, of course, with Gaza and the 7th of October. And that does impact on our organisation as well. Yeah. Do you want to ask me another question, or?
I think the thing that I notice is when somebody brings me their manuscript,
Yes.
some of the trauma that they've experienced has passed from them to the manuscript, and that helps them, but they become incredibly sensitive about how you edit it, how you present it to the world. It carries a big emotional load, probably larger even than the environmental books. And I found it necessary to edit with a very, very light touch, not to change too much in the work that's brought to me, because every word is significant. It's rather like saying to Rembrandt or Van Gogh, could you just leave out some of the brushstrokes, because they're using a lot of paint, and we might want to send the painting through the post and things. But in fact, you need to recognize that even quite small words can be part of the story, the way it's told. And it seems important to me for a press like mine to be careful not to step too hard on the things which are brought to us. But at the moment, we've got a new project. I've had to close the poetry side of the company for a few months because I have masses of poetry and it's really good. But what I'm looking for now is prose. And so I've been talking, and I can see someone in the audience who has sent me something. I'm going to be producing an anthology similar to one of the ones that you produced, Jennifer. And it will look at refugee journeys, both psychological and physical. A lot of the books that I've looked at and edited and published have dealt with the subject of migration, but they're either dealing with it as poetry or as memoir, very long memoir. And I feel that there's room for another short prose anthology. Some of it will be fact-based and some of it will be fiction or memoir, but it just feels it's a different way of approaching this very complicated subject. And I think it helps, as you probably found, Jennifer, when you were publishing, to see a number of stories side by side, recognizing that people who have been displaced have quite a lot in common with each other in terms of how deeply they've been wounded, even though the circumstances that led to them leaving their homes were quite different. So I'm hoping to produce that set of short prose later this year. And at the moment, I'm just busy editing and publishing the seriously large number of books that I ended up with, because some of the authors last year were too stressed to get their books out at the time they hoped. So we ended up with 12 books in 1 year, which has been astonishingly difficult. And I'm determined not to do that again. I need to reduce the number of books so that I can spend more time working with the authors. But it's very satisfying. And there's nothing like that moment when somebody stands up with their book. Here's one of them, Federal Gods. Claire Saponia was in Germany at the moment when Angela Merkel said, we'll take refugees, we'll open our doors to refugees. And in came vast numbers of people in a very short time. Claire was over there teaching English to Germans. And she decided that what she should be doing is to teach German to refugees. So she set up classes in the place that the refugees were sleeping. And it's really the story in a kind of poetic prose of how incredible that was, how stressful and how important. And that kind of book just, it says so much to me. All of us are involved in the refugee crisis. Just because I live in London and I was born in London doesn't mean I'm a part of the trauma that people are experiencing, having to move from where they lived. And I find it very, very disturbing. And Claire does, in her book, explain how difficult it is to see people in trouble and not be able to help. And I really admire what Exiled Writers does to reach out to people and provide mentorship and all the other support. Tell me, how do people find Exiled Writers? How do they get recommended to join you?
We used to do a lot of work in the community, which we need to develop again. We've somehow lost some of those contacts. And then people would come on to through our Exiled Lit cafes, or they hear about us through word of mouth. Social media. Well, we don't always ask them. There isn't always time when you're confronted with a lot of people, at events. We do try and speak to people, and we also have made connections with Right to Life. Right to
Yes,
Life,
me
which
too.
is run by the it's not called that, Freedom from Torture. And so some of those clients come on to our events, and one is actually on our editorial committee because she has a journalistic background.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's something that we've done as well.
But something we need to work on is making those links with the communities again, such as the Afghan community and all the Sudanese and so on.
Mm-hmm.
That we used to run a lot of workshops in different boroughs, sometimes for specific communities, sometimes in specific geographical areas, and sometimes we could afford to employ a kind of interpreter, so alongside the tutor or creative writing facilitator, there would be an interpreter who would go around and work one-to-one and help people sort of translate their thoughts into narrative, which is, in terms of trauma, it may never happen. My mother, for example, was a refugee from Nazi Germany, and she never wanted to speak about the family losses. You know, she was the only survivor of her respective family, and she just closed up when I tried to probe, and but it's, I think, a big step when that trauma becomes narrative, is externalized and is spoken of and then written down. I think that is really a big step to kind of dealing with the trauma in some way.
And also feeling you're not alone, being able to share your story and then other people hearing it saying,
Yes,
this resonates with me.
yes, yes.
Because I think that's
And,
one of the ways we can.
Making sure, yes, that story is known in the wider world, that, you know, the oppression inflicted on peoples in different countries. It's just something we may hear about through the media, but when you hear an individual narrative, it is really meaningful, and it's an act of witness as well, which is really important, that the story is known. So it's not only the individual whose story it is, but it's also an act of witness, that history needs to be remembered, and not be obliterated.
Yeah. History and the culture that went with it, like in that film 3.5 Minutes, where, you know, you see a village just before it was wiped out. You see the uniqueness of each human being and how precious they were and how we must remember them. It's terribly important. I'm conscious in Palewell Press that I see people who think they have a novel or a story. And then you must see people as well, and some of the work that Catherine and Anva does, who haven't got a story yet, who are still finding their way in the language and still finding their way as storytellers, because maybe they come from a culture where they were not supposed to talk. They were not supposed to have an opinion. So there is, if you like, pre-manuscript work that needs doing. And I've started getting involved in that at West London Welcome and Freedom from Torture. But it requires so many people, because each person that you mentor takes a lot of attention and a lot of care.
Yeah,
and
well,
I know that
we've run mentoring and translation schemes where we've asked anyone interested to submit an application, submit a poem or short story, and then we select. We have to, because of the limitations of the funding, and then we allocate a poet, an established poet or writer experienced in tutoring, to the selected exiled writer, and they work, you know, for about 8 weeks, one-to-one. We may need to bring in a sort of editor as well, from the country, or if it's a process of translation, then editing might be required, or, you know, it varies, and then these mentoring and translation schemes have culminated in the production of pamphlets, as I mentioned before, and we had a whole lot printed for each person, and then we gave each person the bulk of their chapbook copies for them to go out into their local area, libraries, community centres, whatever, and, you know, to organise a little evening and sell their chapbooks and get their voice out there. I know some have done that, but, you know, we need to push them and probably organise more ourselves in terms of those chapbooks. But I remember once I worked with, you talked about it being a very satisfying process. I worked with an Afghan poet who knew next to no English, Berang Kodamani. He was very respected in the Afghan community, quite an elderly poet. And I worked alongside an Afghan social worker who did a rough translation of his work. And then I sort of edited it, and she had to, the social worker explained to the poet what it was, you know, in English. But it was really satisfying to see the finished poem, you know. And because this poet, Berang Kodamani, had absolutely no work in English. So, you know, some writers are entrenched in their communities, which is fine, but their work is not heard outside their own communities. I mean, that's a natural thing. My own parents, my father was a refugee as well, the sole survivor of his family. And my parents both belonged to the Association of Jewish Refugees, where they met people with similar backgrounds and shared the problems of money, finding housing. You know, given the Nazis had taken everything, everyone was left with nothing if they came quite late, in say 1939. And so I'm not belittling refugee communities, they're essential, but we want to, you know, the writers at a certain stage want their voices to be heard outside their communities.
Yes. One thing I'm not sure about is the role of libraries in refugee literature. I feel we could do more. I think Palewell Press could do more to have people reading in their local libraries. I've had some very good support from Richmond, Putney and Kensington libraries and West Greenwich, but it's very patchy. You know what I mean? It takes a lot of work to get to a point where you're having an event.
I remember when once we ran an event in one of the libraries, and there wasn't even any publicity up about it. You know, people arriving didn't know where to go, and others who were using the library were not aware that an event was going on, because the librarians, you know, they don't necessarily bother to publicize events. Maybe things have changed now, but I'm trying to think back. Yes, there was once a refugee library project, that doesn't exist anymore.
Tell me about it.
What we did, and again we should do more of. I don't know if you remember the bookshop Borders. I think it was an American chain. The title was very apt in terms of our work, you know, crossing borders. We ran 4 workshops in Borders on Oxford Street. This was for Refugee Week, and we have received some funding for asylum seekers to be given the book that was being. Sorry, they were book groups that we were holding. So we featured the author, and asylum seekers were given the book. We bought the book and donated them to asylum seekers. And so each week we had a different author, a different book. And it was so well attended, and we carefully prepared questions for discussion. Some of it was pair work. This was a teacher and me coming out. We used different methodologies. Pair work, then everybody getting together, and so we did 4 of those, and that was although it wasn't in a library, it was in a bookshop, you know, they were very supportive.
Mhm.
They had a large room attached to the bookshop. There's so much that could be done if only we had, you know,
Enough time.
staff and departments, and it's endless, really. I would want a community group department, a libraries department, you know, that there's so much potential.
Mhm. I know. And although people say, well, you should collaborate, and I do, collaboration takes even more time because you're reaching out to people in another organization and they've got their own objectives and so on. But
Yeah.
for a small organization like mine, you definitely need to be working with other groups.
Yes, yes, yes.
You know, you can't do it all yourself.
I mean, we have in the past collaborated, worked in partnership with Amnesty. In
Mhm.
fact, very recently in March, our March Exiled Lit Cafe focused on imprisoned writers in partnership with Amnesty International. And then we ran, at the time of the the Taliban, you know, returning to take over Afghanistan, we ran a seminar at SOAS, which was partly in partnership with Index on Censorship. We used to do more with English Pen. So yes, they will have their own agendas. We've had a joint event with the Society of Authors, for example. It can be challenging working with other organizations, but
Mm.
uh,
I'm currently
when
working.
it works, it's really helpful.
I know it can be challenging. At the moment, I'm working with two other groups, Kiseta, who have Syrian writers, and Rawani, who have Pakistani writers. And Palewell has a number of Arabic-speaking writers. So we're putting on a joint event in July, um, trying to kind of bridge some of those gaps between cultures that you know so well, Jennifer. But the thing that's coming up very quickly, and which I
Why
hope
don't we get
anybody,
together on that?
sorry,
Why don't we get together on that?
well, absolutely. And then the thing which is coming up very fast is the one which I've written to you about, which is the one called Refugees and Other Friends, which is happening at Kensington Library. And quite a large number of lovely people are going to be reading at that. And I'm really looking forward to it. But if anybody wants details of that, do talk to either me, Jennifer, or Ambrose, because we can all get details of that event. But it's just lovely to do things with people. It just seems to take extra time when you work together because you're having to bring together the aims and feelings of two different organizations. But without that collaboration, I don't think we're going to be anywhere. We
No.
don't have enough influence, if you know what I mean.
Right. Um,
Do you think perhaps we should open this out and ask if anybody has any questions?
That's a good idea. If anyone has any questions, if you just unmute and you can put your questions to Camilla and Jennifer.
Can I ask a question from Jennifer? You said since 7 October there was some changes or something like that in Exiled Writers Ink. Can you explain?
do I think what? Sorry.
In Exiled Writers Ink, there was, you said there was some problem, something like that. I don't remember your exact sentence, but I wonder if it's possible, if you can explain what kind of, problem or was it? Yeah, it's since the 7th of October.
There are always problems when when you work with a range of people all with their own opinions and histories and cultures. Yes, and
Was it to do with the rise in anti-Semitism? Do you remember we were talking about that earlier?
I'm not sure that I have the you know, I don't feel I can reveal too much about this because it's an internal matter, really.
Ah,
You know, it is impacting on sort of the content of our forthcoming magazine. It's a very challenging situation, let's say, when you have people with different backgrounds and political views. I don't think I'm at liberty to sort of go into more detail. That's really sums it up. I don't feel that. I mean, it is something that is impacting on so many organisations. I won't name them, but other literature organisations have had their struggles because of this. We did issue a statement, which we felt was a very diplomatic statement, which acknowledged the pain, you know, on all sides, and the fact that the Middle East situation was impacting on societies outside the Middle East. So you can read that statement on our sort of media page, on the media page of our website. And those who were on our email list would have received it in any case. And that's the ethos we're trying to adhere to, that statement, that bringing together people rather than creating or exacerbating divides. But
it's a subject which has
really
affected all of us.
Difficult. It is really difficult to bring some people who are conflicted here together in terms of perhaps Palestinian and Israeli poetry, for example, would be one area of contention.
I mean, I've found I write a newsletter, and every month I write an editorial. And I deliberately steered clear of writing about Gaza because I sense that I don't have enough real knowledge of what's going on, and that there's a lot of, it would be very easy to wound people with some foolish remark which is meant well. I prepared an editorial about the Middle East. It looked good to me, but like I always do, I took it to a trusted advisor. And she said, Camilla, you just don't know enough about what's going on. There's a lot you could write about, but perhaps this is not your subject right now. And I think this, Nazrin, this is one of the challenges that all of us face. At what point do you say, I mustn't write about this? It's self-censorship. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. But I know that there are a lot of people from different cultures look at Palewell Press. Some of them are Jewish, and they have a history of being involved in the Holocaust. Some are Muslim, whether they agree with everything that's happening. And it would be very, very easy to hurt a lot of people by putting my very uninformed words out there, however sincere they are. And I suspect this is a challenge facing quite a lot of UK organisations.
And there are internal challenges within the Jewish community as well. It's really affecting so many groups in society, in our society. Down to the elections, the forthcoming elections as well.
Yeah.
Yes, so I mean, for quite a while, we avoided the topic, to be honest with you. But, you know, it was affecting so many of our demographic. There was so much pain and hurt, and that's why we felt we needed to get together as a committee and sort of issue a statement acknowledging the pain, as I said before, and we received a lot of sort of relieved emails from different people with different backgrounds, Jewish, Iraqi, and so on, and one or two not so complimentary, two not so complimentary, who have their own agenda, let's say.
Yeah.
I've got a question to Jennifer, please.
Yes.
What's your views on Jewishness versus colonial interest and apartheid, especially in
I don't really feel this is quite relevant to Exiled Writers Ink, to be
sorry,
honest.
I can't hear you.
I don't feel I'm in a position to answer that question.
I was asking
it's not really in the remit of Exiled Writers Ink, and it would need a whole doctorate to answer it, I think, to respond to it.
And another question.
I don't want to be drawn into different perspectives on whether Israel is a colonial project. Is that the sort of thing you have in mind? I won't be drawn on this because I'm the director of an organization that tries very hard to bring people together and not to focus on sort of the politics of what's going on. And in any case, I'm probably not, as Camilla said about herself, I don't see that I'm deeply informed, and there are so many narratives out there from left to right, and so many discourses that I just don't want to be drawn into answering that question.
Can I ask Maida something? Is that okay?
Yes,
Pardon?
of course.
How do you feel we can use literature in this terrible situation? Do you feel there's a role for writers to talk about these subjects, and what happens when they do?
Of course, there is a role, but I think the role of literature in general is to also be able to step out of your bubble and take others into consideration. Because, as you said previously, when we talk about pain and trauma, is also we have to have the ability to write and include other people's suffering in our writings, and especially when we provide platforms for people to publish articles and things, especially people from migrant backgrounds. We really need to provide and give them the voice to be able to also voice their suffering.
Are you also providing a platform? Is that something that you're involved in?
Well, I'm a doctor on gender studies and performance art, and I direct theater plays and work with migrants and people of color.
Oh,
Good.
right.
That sounds really good.
Maybe I didn't could you repeat your question again about colonialism and?
It's fine. I mean, I don't want to push you
Yeah.
to answer my questions. I've got another relevant questions, which is related to the book you published about Jewish people. What was it? Oh, you showed one book about
It's called
Was it the third one?
yes, If Thought Has Memory, Jewish Exiled Writers.
yeah. And you mentioned you like you worked with Jewish people from minority backgrounds.
No, I didn't. No, I worked in further education colleges here in London. In London, no, I haven't worked with. I've steered clear of the Jewish community. I haven't worked with them. No. We did run a project a few years ago called Across the Divide, which brought together Muslims, Jews, and Arabs. This was at the time of one of the intifadas, together to explore narratives, culture, memory, fears, and experience through discussion and creative writing.
That was very good. I went to some of that.
That was a long time ago, did you?
You had an event at, I think you actually had an event at Nottingham when I was up there.
Oh, yes, that one. Yes, that
working on the.
That was kind of an offshoot of that. Yes,
yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And it included live literature events and discussions. And the aim was not dialogue. Dialogue was always going to be difficult, but listening was an important component. So, and that led to the production of a little booklet of people's work. Some was, some of the work expressed a great deal of pain, and I remember one Jewish writer, poet, finding it quite difficult to walk past the store outside Marks and Spencer's in Kilburn, a Palestinian store, which showed sort of pictures of dead children and so on, when she had just brought her tomatoes in Marks and Spencer's, and she found she couldn't sort of deal with that, with being faced with the suffering of these Palestinian children, and she wrote a poem about that. But we ran about 8 weekly sessions with a lot of people. A lot of people came, mostly women. Then we had events with Palestinian writer, Jewish or Israeli writer together. So they each heard each other's narrative and hopefully developed some empathy and understanding, into others' experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the workshops were not about dialogue really, but about listening and kind of trying to reach out and put yourself in the other's shoes.
And one of the questions that that we've been asking has been to ask people taking part to comment on what is happening where they are around forced migration. For example, I think both of you are in London. What are your thoughts on what is happening in the UK, especially around forced migration and around how refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants are being treated by this country?
I have to say, it keeps me awake at night. This is not the country I signed up for. This is not the country that my parents worked for, and I am astonished, not just that refugees are being treated badly, but that people in power think it is okay to boast about it and to praise their minions for doing things which are actually illegal as well as against human rights. I shudder at the actions of those currently in Downing Street and other parts of the elite, that they think it is acceptable, for example, to say that we're not actually against torture. Only in certain circumstances are we against torture, but we're quite happy that torture should happen sometimes. This is not something that should ever be said in a Western democracy, or in fact anywhere. And you cannot then go along and say to someone in another part of the world, why are you torturing your subjects? I'm afraid I think there has been a total loss of leadership and morality at the highest level in this country, and it has affected the lives of dreadful large number of people who came here not expecting to be treated appallingly the way they are. Sorry, Jennifer, I jumped in there.
No. I mean, I agree with everything you've said. And in fact, I remember when we went to the Calais migrant camp a few years ago to run some workshops with the refugees, and we took along books in the languages of the main communities in the migrant camps. And we took along some writers who shared the languages of those communities as well, in terms of the workshops and live literature performances. And as I mentioned before, we demonstrated outside the Royal Courts of Justice against the Rwanda proposal. We sent a letter to the Guardian about it, signed by lots of Exiled Writers Ink people. So we, the non-exiled, although I'm second generation, we don't speak for our exiled, as I call it, refugee and migrant communities. They have their own voices. They signed the letter. They went to demonstrate outside the Royal Courts of Justice and to Calais. We find that most of our writers focus on the past, in terms of nostalgia, their families, or it might have been a negative past in terms of imprisonment and torture, and they still have very strong axial links with their country of origin, with the current. They're very involved in the current politics of their country, and they demonstrate here. In fact, I was involved in one of those demonstrations just a couple of weeks ago, and I was a bit of a coward because I thought, well, will I be safe after I've spoken out against this particular regime? So I find that generally the focus is on the link with the country of origin, and somehow the exiled writers are living in this space here, but not necessarily that involved in it. They're not really writing too much about living in the UK. The problems, the hostile environment, etc. My experience.
Yeah. And also,
sorry, what I was going to say is, I think that the whole of the Northern Hemisphere is going to have to come up with some answers very soon, because if you look at what's happening in different parts of the world, life is becoming impossible, sometimes because of war, but very often simply because of flooding or drought or other kinds of environmental disasters. And people are moving. They have to move. People have always moved. My ancestors moved. Your ancestors moved. And it isn't a crime, and they should not be made to feel like a worm by somebody. But somehow Europe has not addressed this, and nor have quite a number of the other big organizations, rather like America and Australia and so on. We're all struggling as nations with how we deal with the fact that human beings like ourselves are having to move away from where they lived. What are we going to do? It's a very small number now compared to what it will be in 20 years' time. And I really don't see leadership coming forward and dealing with it. I feel really deeply worried about this. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I was going to say, related to what Maida was asking about, how, like on the one hand, in Britain, Britain and other European countries have rightly offered refuge to Ukrainians, but at the same time, currently Britain is imprisoning other refugees who are fleeing other wars.
Yeah,
like Sudanese nationals or Eritrean nationals. And I was just going to ask you, the two of you, how you make sense of that.
I think for me, this is one of the subjects that we have to write about. It's no longer simply prejudice that refugees face. It's actual acts against their person. And I think the breakdown of the rule of law, for example, in the days when my father was a barrister, if there was an injunction in court saying, do not put somebody on an aeroplane, you would never have got a law officer doing so. Somehow we have moved to a point where politics has become more powerful than any of the other arms of government, and awful things have been done with the force of the police and Group 4 security and so on. But I'm interested, in a sense, this is a human rights subject rather than just a refugee subject. We're looking at the breakdown of Britain's infrastructure and the way it's governed. We're not just looking at a problem for refugees, however dreadful that is. The country as a whole is in trouble. It's not looking after its poor. It's not looking after feeding the children. It's not investing in education.
I
Britain
think
has
there
got
has always
massive problems.
There has always been opposition to refugees. In Britain passed the 1904 Aliens Act when whole waves of refugees from Eastern Europe were trying to enter the UK, from Russia and Poland. And in terms of the refugees from the Nazis, Britain had completely opposed to receiving them, apart from the kinder transport, about 10,000 children who were not allowed to come with their parents, which was a really cruel act. And then they did, however, allow a transit camp to be set up called Kitchener Camp, which was not funded by the British state. They washed their hands of it, but by the the German Jewish organization here. The Central Fund for German Jewry, it was called. And in fact, the camp was just supposed to be a transit camp, but the young men, about 4,000 of them, were expected to move on to other countries. And of course, there's the infamous story of the internment of refugees on the Isle of Man, when Churchill had said, collar the lot in case they were spies. And sometimes they were imprisoned with Nazis who had persecuted them. No benefits were provided at that time. So I think that Britain does not have a history of welcoming refugees, although it often kind of conveys the impression that it's a benevolent country, welcoming and so on. But I don't think we need to be entirely negative. There are many, many good people in Britain who care about refugees, who work with refugees. There are refugee projects. What about, the refugee homes, the homes project that provided homes for Ukrainians and others. So
I agree with you.
The policies are so iniquitous.
Yeah.
Not all the people are,
No, it's not all the people.
Anti the other.
Yeah. I mean, this book, for example, this is about, this is Malka Al-Haddad, about her time in Yarl's Wood, interned there, and how she struggled with her mental health because of everything that the Home Office did to her. And we should and do publish work about that. But I just feel very, very distraught about those who are currently in power and perhaps won't be in power at the end of the election, one doesn't know. But the period of time in which they have been here, successive Home Secretaries behaving in an extraordinarily bad way towards vulnerable refugees. And it's extremely bad to have to own that as part of our country. I'm not talking about the very decent large number of people who do.
Horrible places, and there used to be regular demonstrations outside them, and projects involving people visiting those who were detained. But it had a terrible effect on the prisoners' mental health.
It's a very interesting question from
really
Karen.
like prisoners, as far as I remember.
Yeah. Ambrose, I saw a really interesting question from Karen in the chat.
Yeah, Karen, do you want to ask your question?
No, the reason I write it down is because I don't speak very clearly. I'm a much better writer than a speaker.
It's just, I think you're right. I think there are economic pressures driving some of the activities.
Yeah, and this is something that most people are not aware of. I know in the US, from my experience working with carceral systems, that most of the prison systems now are actually run and operated by immigrants from other countries. They're essential to the operation of the prison because many times they're intelligent people. They're used to working with other people. They know how to get things done. Could be great benefit to American industry, but unfortunately they're incarcerated, and the prison systems really depend on them for running workshops, for cooking food, for providing services within the prison to allow it to continue to function. So, the American public is not aware of this because they choose to ignore people in these big boxes. That's how we get rid of the problem as a society. But again, if you have an option to do work within the carceral system, through volunteers, perhaps, a lot of churches do this here, to give these prisoners a voice, particularly if they are from other countries. This may help expose this.
Yeah.
corruption.
I did a comparison some years ago between the prison systems in China, America, and Russia. They were startlingly similar. And there was a lot of money involved in keeping them going. But I don't know how far that has happened in the UK, but I definitely know that the outsourcing to Group 4 Security and other groups has made it very tempting for everyone to keep on shutting up refugees because there's money in it. I don't.
Well, I think that it's important for people to know that if it doesn't, it was Danbury again, one of our history's most human rights advocate that said if you want to get minority groups out of prisons, then somebody has to take their place. Because they're not going to go anywhere.
I mean, the prisons aren't. Yeah.
Yes, right.
Like an industry.
So the solution is we will go in and take their place. And to get that message to people, the average citizen, it may be their son or daughter. It may, in the US, it may be their wives if they choose to have an abortion in a state that no longer allows it. So the criminalization of just everyday activity is part of the US future unless we really stop it. And that has to come from people.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Jennifer and Camilla, you could also say something about the money that is being made by people who are warehousing refugees, and also people who are running the immigration estate and the housing estate.
Was that to me?
Yeah, to you and Jennifer.
The people running the immigration
estate, this ranges from the G4Ss, the SECOs.
But I don't have direct experience of that. I only know what I've read in the media about placing people on the boat, the boat that's moored in Dorset, and in hotels, and trying to move them out of hotels, and demonstrations by local people. Of course, housing, hostels, whatever, needs to be provided. There has to be a practical solution, but I'm no expert on what the solution is. People need to be able to come legally. We know all the arguments. They need to be able to apply legally from their country of origin and not be forced to travel by dangerous means, by boats, by these rubber dinghies, with the ensuing loss of life. It's a problem all over Europe because, Italy, with the refugees trying to make their way to Lampedusa, Greece, and it's a Europe-wide issue, really. And if only the countries themselves, the countries of origin, were well developed, were not run by patriarchies, colonialism, there's a colonial history. There's so many reasons why people feel forced to move to Europe or America, Canada, Australia, and each country is searching for a way to sort of welcome the refugees and integrate them. I think some countries do have better integration systems, housing, classes, opportunities for further education. But there's a shortage of resources. And as I said, I know from my own parents' experiences how difficult it was for them. I know that they were in a one-room flat or something, and they weren't allowed to have babies, to keep a baby. I was a baby. They weren't allowed to keep me there. That has sometimes happened at that time. And so I was placed in a sort of residential nursery for about a year and a half. And, you know, it's always been a struggle for refugees. But you would think that by now, the situation would have been dealt with systematically. But it's a complete, it's shambolic.
Mm-hmm. I think the answer is I don't have an answer, but I do feel there has been political capital made out of refugees. People have been treating them badly because they thought they could win votes by doing so. And I hope that when the election comes, that the policies will change. But I think refugees have fallen foul of a lot of governments in Europe, at least, because it suited certain politicians to look good to certain parts of the electorate. And it's just been an appalling time to be a refugee. I mean, it's been never good to be a refugee, but it seems to be getting worse. We're ending up in regimes that are swinging wildly to the right and talking about the other as if they were monsters rather than just people like us. And this is where I like the work that Exiled Writers do, because what it tries to do is to show the complexity of these subjects, that it's not easy to give an answer, but that we should search for answers.
Yeah.
Certainly important to me.
We have
And then
to
maybe
put pressure on governments, of whatever ilk, to take this seriously, take the question of refugees seriously, and they need to develop systems and empathy and a welcome instead of denigrating them and seeing them as a problem. I mean, this has been spoken about so much, you know, on so many programs, Question Time and so on. But, and of course, countries like Hungary have closed borders. The right-wing government that has closed borders will not accept any refugees. And so many want to come to England because they have family here, because they already speak English, because they won't have access to educational opportunities in some of the other European countries. And we should stop perceiving them as sort of scroungers or bogus or, you know, we should stop stereotyping them, because all refugees have their stories, their culture, their background, their histories, their literature, their skills.
And maybe we have this as our penultimate question. In all that we've talked about, is there anything that you want to add, emphasize, or stress? And this is in relation to questions around refugees, around forced migration and also around poetry and publishing.
I know that one of the problems, and this is seen very much from inside Palewell Press, I can produce books, and I have produced books about what the Home Office is doing or what it was like to be struggling with a famine somewhere. But I'm finding it very difficult to get those books into the hands of readers. And so I would urge anybody who's been listening to this on YouTube, if you know of places that would be interested in having books about refugees and the problems that they face, please let us know, because we want more people to know about the things we're writing about. It's a very parochial thing to say, but if a book just sits on a shelf somewhere and no one reads it, it's not doing its work. So I really hope that anybody who hears this will speak to those they know, whether they're teachers or bookshops or whatever, or libraries, and encourage them to take an interest in the work that is being published by Exiled Writers Ink and Palewell Press and Words Without Borders and so on, because we really do need more readers.
I think the situation has improved. Previously, very few mainstream publishers published work by those who wrote in a different language and had their work translated, for example, or by migrants. I think I can't give you the statistics, but I know that even now, very little work is translated compared to, say, Sweden or the Nordic countries. And I think that the mainstream publishers are now more aware of the need to be inclusive, to provide opportunities for other voices, providing, you know, they perceive the work to be of a certain sort of quality or standard, but it's still very difficult. I mean, we are a partner with the free, what's it called, the literary consultancy. The literary consultancy have a free scheme whereby the experienced editors read a person's work and write a very detailed report on it, suggesting ways of improving it. And some of those writers may, once they work on their, you know, material, may progress to having their work published, or we encourage them to enter literary competitions, to send their work to literary magazines. That has been part of our workshop sort of ethos. But can I end with a little poem from my book?
Yes, yes, please. Yes.
So we could all have been refugees, there but for fate go I. So this poem is called I Could Have Been, and it mentioned Uruguay. My mother, who was from Berlin, was bound for Uruguay. She was going to flee to Uruguay, but the Uruguayan consul was recalled and took everyone's documents, visas, etc. with him. Perhaps there was a revolution there, I don't know. She then managed to come here as a domestic. A certain number of young German and Austrian Jewish women were allowed in as domestics by the British government. So they were, you know, very hard for English families. And it's dedicated to Freddie, who would have been my older cousin. He was murdered by the Nazis in 1942 at the age of 3. Sorry, I meant to read In Her Shoes, In Her Shoes. The two poems go together in tandem, really. So I'll just read In Her Shoes. And it's about our visit to Calais and the station there is called Fretin, and a lot of migrants, asylum seekers, hang around the station, or hung around the station, hoping to get onto the Eurostar trains to Britain. But of course, there are police, gendarmes watching, there's CCTV, but we could all have been in the migrants' shoes. So it's only a short poem. Calais Fretin station lies heavy with silence, marooned in the night outside time. Steel walls, steel ceiling, sting with cold. The shadows devour watching figures. She hugs her rucksack like a baby. The refugee woman is on the prowl. CCTV is rolling, police eyes darting. I could have been her, she, me. The Eurostar sliding doors rush open. The warm coffee carriage sucks me in. The doors snap shut in a fit of contempt. You, me rejected. Me, you, trudge back to camp. Me, she, me, she, me, she. The train races against the night of mist and the memory of my guilt. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. How about you, Camilla? Do you have a poem? Maybe
I
from
do
one of your
actually.
authors.
It's the title poem from Malka's book. Malka spent about 11 years trying to get her case recognized as a genuine one by the Home Office. And this is called The Truth at the End of the Night. I lie about everything. This is what the representative of the Home Office said to me. The truth is that I lied to my children when I promised a roof to protect them from the fragments of war. I lied to my father when I told him I stopped being afraid of invaders. And I lied to my mother that one day I will free my sisters from the chains of the clan. I lied to my friends who were killed in the war that I would meet them and drink together in front of the Statue of Liberty. I lied when I reassured my love we would master turning the pages of disappointment, and our freedom aches would not last long. After 10 years of Home Office challenges, still their hands are spiders mapping bullets in the walls of my sanctuary. It seems I've lied more than politicians do, and lie more than Boris Johnson, and lie more than warlords. It seems that everything in my life is a lie, except what I write here.
Mhm.
So a great guy, really good woman. And I'm very pleased to be doing what I'm doing. I just wish we could have more impact.
Yeah,
I really feel bad about how
definitely,
things are.
definitely.
Thank you, Ambrose, very much for encouraging us to talk. And thank you, Jennifer. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you, Ambrose.
Yeah. And then I mentioned that my question was in two parts here. So this is the final one. Maybe if you could say something about hope.
Yes.
Both of you. And then we end on that note.
It is certainly at the heart of what I'm trying to do. Every newsletter, I try to find things which are looking to the future, people who are succeeding, fulfilling their dream, recovering. And it is true that there is a lot to be hopeful about, and that without hope, we're lost. And it's great when the books that I publish manage to find hopeful outcomes. Perhaps I'm feeling particularly low this evening, but as far as I'm concerned, literature is very much a way of building a better world, and you have to have hope if you're going to do that.
Yes, human beings need to live with hope. That's what keeps us going. That's what motivates us to be creative, to live another day. And I have felt sort of hopeful. I don't know if it was actually hope, but when, you know, there's understanding develops between individuals and groups, and those barriers are overcome, we cross borders, and somehow there seems to be hope for the future. It's a very depressing time at the moment in the world with all the wars and conflicts, many of which are not reported on, but we really must aspire to have a coffee with the other, you know, just talk, stop stereotyping, and that's, if that happens, then I feel kind of hopeful for the future. Yeah.
So on that note, I say thank you to you, Camilla, and also thank you to Jennifer and to everyone who attended. The next set of conversations will be taking place next month, which is June. June is also special because on the 20th, we have World Refugee Day. And I think from the, and during that week, that month as well, we've got Refugee Week here in the UK. So in light of that, for our part is post-migration in the arts, instead of having a session on the last Thursday of each month, we'll have a session every Thursday for the month of June, so that we can keep talking about what is happening around forced migration in the arts, not only in the UK, but also around the world. So on that note, I say thank you and see you again next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.